By the autumn of 1944, the war in Western Europe had entered a grim, grinding phase. The Allied breakout from Normandy was a memory, and the armies of Generals Eisenhower and Montgomery were now clawing their way toward the German frontier against stiffening resistance. Daylight belonged to the Allies. Swarms of P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts swept the skies, making any significant German movement a suicidal proposition. But when the sun set, the equation changed. Under the cloak of darkness, the Luftwaffe's night fighter force, the Nachtjagd, still owned the sky. Seasoned German crews in Messerschmitt Bf 110s and Junkers Ju 88s would rise from their hidden airfields to prey on Allied supply lines, bomb sleeping troop concentrations, and harass the vulnerable airfields that were the source of Allied daytime strength. The on-paper matchup for this nocturnal war was one of experience versus technology. The Germans possessed a cadre of expert pilots and radar operators, the Experten, who had spent years perfecting the art of night interception. They were masters of a sophisticated ground control system that guided them toward their targets, and their own airborne Liechtenstein radar, while less advanced, was a known and trusted quantity. The American response was a machine born of a single, radical idea: the Northrop P-61 Black Widow. It was the first aircraft in history designed from the ground up as a dedicated night fighter. To the Luftwaffe pilots who caught a glimpse of it on a distant runway, it was an absurdity. A hulking twin-boom behemoth painted a non-reflective black, looking more like a medium bomber than a fighter. It was too big, too heavy, and too ugly to be a threat. This initial assessment was a profound and soon-to-be fatal misreading of American doctrine. The U.S. Army Air Forces weren't betting on pilot experience, which they lacked in the night fighting realm. They were betting on a piece of revolutionary technology housed in the P-61's bulbous nose, the SCR-720 Airborne Intercept Radar. The Germans were shadowboxers, masters of fighting in the dark with senses they had honed over years. The Americans were about to turn on the lights. The crews of the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron, newly based in the damp fields of eastern France, knew what the Germans thought of their aircraft. They'd heard the scoffs and jokes relayed through intelligence channels. The Black Widow was ungainly. It flew like a truck. But inside the cockpit, Lieutenant David Johnson felt the steady power of the two Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engines, and knew the mockery was misplaced. The P-61 wasn't built for dogfighting. It was a weapons platform, a stable gun carriage designed to carry a pilot, a gunner, and a wizard to a precise point in the black sky. That wizard was the radar operator navigator, or RO, tucked away in a dark compartment in the rear of the crew nacelle. For him, the war was not a thing of vision, but of electronics. A fictional diary entry from an RO of the period might have read, "The pilot sees nothing but instrument glow. For me, the whole universe is a 5-inch cathode ray tube. It's a storm of green static, and my job is to find the one ghost in that machine." The Germans had the skill. The Americans had the ghost detector. The P-61's firepower was also no joke. 4 20mm cannons in the belly and 4.50 caliber machine guns in a remote-controlled dorsal turret. It carried more frontal firepower than a B-17 Flying Fortress. The Black Widow was slow compared to a single-engine fighter, but it was faster than the German bombers it was built to hunt. It was less maneuverable than a Bf-109, but the Luftwaffe's night fighters were not nimble opponents either. The Americans were bringing a shotgun to a knife fight. As the autumn rains turned French airfields to mud and the nights grew longer, the stage was set. In the German mess halls, pilots joked about the clumsy Schwarz-Witwe. In the ready rooms of the 422nd, men drank coffee, studied maps, and put their faith not in their eyes, but in the glowing green scope of the SCR-720. The conflict would not be decided by what the pilots could see, but by who could see first. The night of November 16, 1944, was moonless and thick with high overcast, a perfect hunting ground for Hauptmann Klaus Richter. His Junkers Ju 88G6 was one of the Luftwaffe's most formidable night fighters, its nose bristling with the Hirschgeweih, stag's antlers, antenna array of its FUG-220 Liechtenstein SN2 radar. Richter and his two-man crew were veterans. a finely honed team who felt more at home in the black void above the Rhine than they did on the ground. Their mission was a freelance patrol, or freie Jagd, aimed at disrupting Allied night bomber activity. For 2 hours, they had seen nothing. Richter scanned the empty dark, confident that his was the superior machine, the superior skill. Any American plane clumsy enough to be out tonight was simply prey waiting to be found. 70 miles to the west, Lieutenant David Johnson held his P-61 in a lazy, predetermined search pattern. The flight was monotonous, a long exercise in instrument flying. "Anything, Stan?" he grunted over the intercom. In his cramped rear compartment, Sergeant Stan Kowalski, the RO, stared intently at the hypnotic sweep of the green line on his scope. For him, the only reality was the electronic pulse his radar sent out into the darkness. Negative, Skipper, just the usual ground clutter. The American system was far more powerful than its German counterpart. The P-61's SCR-720 could scan a massive volume of sky ahead of the aircraft. But this power meant it was also sensitive, picking up all manner of phantom signals that required a trained eye to dismiss. The Germans relied on experience to find their targets. The Americans relied on a machine that could see for 5 miles in pitch darkness. Suddenly, Kowalski leaned forward. A tiny, persistent fleck of light had appeared at the extreme edge of his scope. It was faint, but it was solid. "Contact! Wait one, contact! Range 5 miles, bearing 015, slightly above us." Johnson's posture straightened instantly. "Roger that, coming to new heading." He banked the big fighter gently, his eyes seeing nothing but the inky blackness beyond his windscreen. The P-61 was now a slave to the instructions coming from the man in the back. There was no visual, no engine noise, just the calm, disembodied voice of the RO guiding the 15-ton Hunter. "Range 4 miles, he's holding steady. Looks like he's on a westerly course." Inside the Ju-88, Richter and his crew saw and heard nothing. Their own radar was pointed forward, its detection cone relatively narrow. They were being stalked from their 6 o'clock low, a blind spot they never imagined could be so expertly exploited. Their first warning would also be their last. 2 miles, Kowalski called out. "I'm switching it to your scope." On Johnson's instrument panel, a smaller 3-inch repeater scope flickered to life, showing a single, dancing blip. The technology was leading him by the hand. 1 mile. You should have him in sight any second. Johnson strained his eyes, scanning the starless void where the radar told him an enemy aircraft was flying. Nothing. Still nothing, Stan. A bead of sweat traced a path down his temple. This was the moment of truth, where the system had to translate from an electronic ghost to a solid target. "Range 800 yards. He's right in front of you," Kowalski pressed, his voice tight. And then Johnson saw it, a faint, almost imperceptible smudge, a charcoal gray shape against a slightly less dark patch of cloud. A Ju-88. He eased the throttles forward, closing the final distance with terrifying speed. The German crew flew on, oblivious. There was no chase, no skillful dogfight. This was an execution. Johnson centered the silhouette in his gun sight and depressed the firing button. 4 20mm cannons erupted with a deafening roar, the explosive shells tearing into the Ju-88's right wing, root, and fuselage. A brilliant orange flash illuminated the night as the German night fighter's fuel tanks ignited. It cartwheeled once, a burning ruin, and then plunged toward the unseen earth below. The entire engagement, from initial contact to kill, had taken less than 4 minutes. Johnson banked his Black Widow away from the fireball, the only light in a sky that his machine had conquered. On December 16, 1944, the Wehrmacht launched its last great offensive in the West. Crashing through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest, the German army's success depended on one critical factor: weather. A thick blanket of snow, fog, and low-hanging cloud had settled over the region, grounding the 9th Air Force and its dreaded fighter bombers. Under this impenetrable gray shield, German columns advanced with a freedom they hadn't known since 1940. For the first few days of the Battle of the Bulge, the most powerful air force in the world could do little but watch from the ground. However, the weather that blinded the P-47s and P-51s was merely an obstacle for the P-61 Black Widows of the 422nd and 425th Night Fighter Squadrons. Called upon to perform missions they were never intended for, the P-61s became the only Allied aircraft capable of operating over the front. Their orders were simple and brutal: fly into the soup and hit anything German. The Black Widow, designed as a high-altitude interceptor, was about to become a low-level, all-weather predator. A pilot from the 422nd later recalled the grim directive: "The brass told us to hit anything that moved, so we did." On the night of December 23rd, two P-61s descended through the muck, leveling off just a few hundred feet above the snow-covered pines. They were flying on instruments and radar, navigating the treacherous valleys west of St. Vith. Their ROs used the ground mapping function of their SCR-720 radar to paint a crude image of the terrain ahead, calling out ridges and ravines to their pilots. Suddenly, an RO's voice crackled over the radio. "Bingo! I've got a line of movers on the scope. A big one, following the road in the valley up ahead." The two Black Widows banked and dropped into the valley. Below them, a German supply convoy, trucks, half-tracks, and fuel tankers belonging to the 1st SS Panzer Corps, was grinding its way toward the front, its commanders confident in the protection of the storm. They never saw the two Black Wraiths approaching. The attack was a study in controlled violence. The P-61s swept in low and fast, their four 20mm cannons opening up with a sound like tearing canvas. Explosive shells ripped through the thin skins of the fuel trucks, which erupted in spectacular blossoms of fire. The convoys, packed nose to tail on the narrow road, descended into chaos. On a second pass, the P-61's dorsal turrets, slaved to the gunner's sights, spat streams of .50 caliber tracers into the scattering German infantry. For the German ground troops, it was a waking nightmare. An enemy they couldn't see was tearing them apart from a sky that was supposed to be safe. Alerted by the carnage, a lone Messerschmitt Bf-110 night fighter on patrol dove to intervene. This was the fight its pilot was trained for, a classic defense against low-level attackers. He latched onto the tail of the second P-61, his own cannons blazing. But the American machine was no lumbering bomber. The P-61 pilot, alerted by his gunner, broke hard, the heavy airframe groaning under the strain. As the German pilot struggled to follow the unexpected maneuver, the first P-61, guided by its own radar, swung around and acquired the German fighter. The Bf-110 pilot, focused entirely on his initial target, was ambushed. A precise 3-second burst from the Black Widow's cannons tore the Messerschmitt's wing off. It vanished into the forest below without a flame. The two P-61s climbed back into the concealing clouds, leaving behind a burning, blocked road that would deprive a German panzer unit of its desperately needed fuel and ammunition. The laughter had stopped. In the most critical battle on the Western Front, the clumsy, ugly Black Widow had proven to be the only weapon that could fight and win in the dark. By the spring of 1945, the laughter was long gone. The remnants of the Luftwaffe's Nachtjagd, starved of fuel, replacement parts, and experienced crews, were a shadow of their former strength. The Ardennes offensive had been their final, costly gamble. Now, the P-61 Black Widows roamed over the Reich with near impunity. The presence of just a few of these radar-equipped hunters was enough to clear a sector of the sky. German pilots, who once charged into the darkness with confidence, now took off with the gnawing fear of an enemy who could see them when they were blind. The psychological advantage had been decisively reversed. The combat record of the P-61 tells a story of remarkable efficiency. While its total number of aerial victories, around 125, was modest compared to the staggering tallies of daytime fighters like the P-51, this figure is misleading. The Black Widow operated in the most dangerous of environments, and its kill-to-loss ratio in air-to-air combat was formidable. It achieved its mission not by racking up huge scores, but by making German nocturnal operations prohibitively expensive. In a fitting endnote to its service, a P-61 of the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron was credited with the last Allied air-to-air victory of the war in the European theater on the night of May 8, 1945. The ultimate legacy of the P-61 Black Widow, however, extends far beyond its wartime service record. The aircraft itself was a transitional design, a powerful piston engine machine that would quickly be rendered obsolete by the dawn of the jet age. But the technology it carried in its nose and the doctrine it validated were revolutionary. The German approach to night fighting was an attempt to perfect the human warrior, creating aces with uncanny senses and years of experience. The American approach, embodied by the P-61, was to create a system that made the ace's sixth sense irrelevant. It was a victory of the integrated weapon system over individual prowess. This philosophy shaped the future of aerial combat. The P-61's crew configuration, a pilot focused on flying and a dedicated operator focused on managing the complex radar and weapons systems, became the standard for all-weather interceptors for the next 50 years, from the F-89 Scorpion and F-4 Phantom to the F-14 Tomcat. The concept of achieving a kill without the enemy ever knowing they were being tracked became the central goal of modern air warfare. The black boxes that fused radar, navigation, and communication into a single tactical picture are the direct descendants of the flickering green scope inside the Black Widow. The P-61 was more than just a successful aircraft. It was a prophecy written in aluminum and wires. It demonstrated that future wars would be won, not just by the fastest plane or the bravest pilot, but by the side that could best control the electromagnetic spectrum. The German pilots who first saw the strange, ungainly machine were right in one respect. It wasn't a classic fighter. It was something new, a flying laboratory for a new way of war. They laughed because they couldn't understand it, and they were defeated because they never learned to see in the dark.